Hello and welcome. Today we're looking at the T'au Pathfinders. Now this is a kill team that I've had since the Chownath box, but today we're going to get into it and paint some T'au. I'm starting things off with the usual prime method of black all over, and I've already assembled the miniatures. There's a ton of options, but I just went for mostly specialists and a few drones. And then I'm going to hit it with some white from roughly 45 degrees. My airbrush was kind of acting up a little funny, so the white came out kind of fluffy, but we can correct that with some paint. So starting off, we're using a Grim Black Speedpaint. And I'm just using this to quickly add some color to the lower half of the Pathfinders. You can kind of see that the paint is almost like spidering outwards because of the fluffiness of the white prime that I did. And I'm not sure if that was because of the temperature or the PSI on the airbrush, but either way, once you start adding some layers of paint, that normally fills in some of those gaps. And you can see that I'm also using this for the undersuit, so under the arms and around the back of the neck as well. For the color scheme, I wanted to go for something quite neon and vibrant, so I'm starting off with Wild Rider Red, and then afterwards I kind of realized that this was almost kill team colors. But I'm okay with that. So I'm just doing a quick application on all of the armor sections. I'm not too worried about the coverage. If it needs multiple coats, that's fine. But I'm envisioning this as a very vibrant orange on the armor. And so to shade this, I'm going to be using Carroburg Crimson. And the reason I chose this red wash rather than like a non-oil or a black is because I really wanted to maintain that vibrancy in those red tones. So I'm kind of keeping the shadows a very, very deep red, and also it kind of punches up that Wild Rider red a little bit as well. I'm just taking care not to get it on the black undersuit that I've already painted. For the faces, I'm going to be using the Fang. And I was originally going to go for a much more vibrant blue. I kind of had this vision in my head of like really, really blue skin against really, really bright orange. But I wanted to kind of stay true to the colors of the T'au. So I ended up using a much more subtle blue, a muted blue. And then while that's drying, I then went back through and did all of their weapons with a Grim Black. I'm leaving certain sections of the rifles for another color because I felt like there was already way too much black here, so I'm going to break that up with a different color. And I decided on a kind of desaturated brown, so this is Baneblade brown, and I'm using this for the middle section of the rifle as well as the scope and the top of the stock. And this kind of tertiary color helps just break up some of those areas of black. So to shade this, I'm just going to do a quick non-oil over the rifle. This just helps add in some of those shadows and fill in some of the gaps that I may have missed with the initial base coat. I felt like some of the Grim Black application was a little thin, so I went back and added some non-oil to the lower half of the Pathfinders, and this really helped fill in some of those shadows and reintroduce that black back into it. I'm using plate mail metal for some of the smaller details. So for example, the rail rifle here and also some of the smaller pouches. I'm basically trying to fill in as much of the details as I can with a base coat before applying the wash. And once that non-oil is dry, I'll go back in with that original Baneblade and just re-highlight some of those panels. Sometimes the wash can kind of bring down the tone, the overall brightness of the original paint, so this helps reintroduce that color. I'm going to be adding some Elven gold as kind of a accent punch. So I'm just choosing some of these spherical designs on the gun and on the armor, and I'm just using this to kind of break up those bigger areas of color, but also kind of introduce a metallic and draw the eye to these circular designs. Some of the other metallics, I decided to use cobalt metal, and this is kind of a blue metallic plate metal looking paint, so I decided to use this for some of the more unique devices on the T'au. There's a guy with a cybernetic arm, there's a drone controller here, so I'm just using this for some of those equipment pieces. I've decided I'm going to start working on the armor, so I'm using that original Wild Rider Red, and I'm filling in some of those bigger areas. Basically, any of the kind of flat panel areas I'm going back over, but I'm making sure to leave the gaps between and the recesses in that original deep red shade. And then I'm using Trollslayer orange, and I'm starting to highlight back into that neon orange that I envisioned. This paint is a little thin, so this is maybe 2 coats on each of these panel sections, just to help kind of fill in some of those paint streak marks that the brush might leave. But what you can see is it's starting to kind of glaze in that saturation again. And so I'm just working my way around each of these models and just applying this just to help kind of bring back that saturated punch. And then next I'm going to be using some T'au Light Ochre. And the reason I'm using yellow is because it will increase the brightness of the orange, but also keep the saturated look of those yellow oranges. If I was to use white, it would kind of desaturate it into almost like a peach color. So I'm using this yellow with a little bit of the Trollslayer mixed in, and I'm just edge highlighting some of these panels on the armor. And this helps to just really sell the idea that this is a bright orange in almost like a daylight situation. Next up we have some neutral grey, and I'm finally getting around to painting the rest of the equipment. So these like earpieces that they have, I'm doing this in that neutral grey. A lot of the heads have binoculars and VR headsets and things like that. So I'm just adding this in for a base coat on those equipment pieces. I love the T'au helmet design, but I was kind of leaning towards the individual faces. Kill Team's all about individual specialists that are each like the guy, you know, the medic, the heavy. And so I wanted to kind of make each character feel unique. Next up, I'm using a Tyran blue shade, and I'm just very carefully going around the kind of the recesses in the face. I didn't want to shade the whole face and then highlight it back up to that Fang color. So I'm just dabbing this into the eye sockets, around the eyes, around the back of the neck where the head meets the neck piece, and just underneath any of the goggles and equipment. And what this is doing is it's giving me a core shadow that I can build upon and highlight the rest of the face with. So for that I'm using Russ Grey, and this is still in that desaturated blue spectrum, and I'm using this to just highlight the face like I would with a normal flesh colored face, but with a blue scale instead of a flesh tone scale. So I'm just going through and catching some of the raised areas like around the eyebrows, the top of the head, just any area that light would hit his face naturally. This first coat is actually a mix between Russ Grey and the Fang, and now I'm going in with pure Russ Grey because it's much more brighter and I wanted the step up between those colors to be a little bit more subtle. So now I'm going back in with that Russ Grey and just kind of edge highlighting some of those features, doing smaller and smaller areas. I'm going to mix in some white to keep that desaturated blue going, and so Bold Titanium White is my preferred white paint. And I'm mixing that into the Russ Grey for kind of an edge highlight. I don't want to go pure white because then he'll appear a little bit too shiny. So this is just kind of my highest white that I'm going to be using on the faces. And then I'm making sure that I get a highlight on the top of the head as well. For the eyes, I'm just using T'au Light Ochre again, and then cleaning up any overspill with some of that blue. I've decided to introduce some wine red. So I've mixed this with the Fang color that we've used already, and it made this kind of deep purple bluish color. And I really love using this for some of the areas around the face. This helps to add variation in the skin tone and just kind of breaks up those blue desaturated colors. In human terms, this would be kind of red flushed cheeks, I suppose. And then I use some wine red mixed with some white for some of the scarring, specifically on the blooded operative here. I mixed this right the way down, and so it just kind of sunk into that recess in the sculpt. And then I cleaned up the line with some rust grey. For the antenna and the goggles, I'm just using a Nuln oil. I wanted to just throw something on real quick, just to help shade in some of these equipment pieces. And while I have those blue tones on the palette, I'm just making sure that I get their feet. I'm not too worried about too many highlights. I'm just doing a quick Fang blue and then a rust grey highlight, because I intend on adding some weathering and dust. I'm going to go a little bit wacky on some of the markings. I decided to do just a pure titanium white and just do some kind of geometric markings, randomized and all over the armor, just in random places. And because I want these to look kind of weathered, I'm kind of dabbing on the brush and just making it look like the paint has kind of been chipped off over time. The method that I found really helps is just to kind of roughly sketch in the shape with the paint and then fill in the shape just by kind of dabbing on the brush and just filling in that white. And then I would take the Wild Rider red and then just kind of gently chip away, and anywhere that there's like a crease or a hard edge, I would kind of break that up with just a very, very light touch of that. And it kind of implies that the paint has kind of been scratched off. There was no real rhyme or reason behind the markings. I just kind of threw on some random stripes or squares and just had fun, making each character feel unique. I also used this white to prep any of the areas that I want kind of a holographic blue. So for example, the controls on the drone operator, and then a lot of the goggles and the lenses on the helmets, I just started to prep these with that pure white. I'm using Kroxigor scales, and this is a contrast paint, so this is very, very saturated, and it works really good on a white undercoat. So this is just a single coat of that paint, just to kind of get that blue in place. It's a different type of blue, it's kind of an aquamarine. But because this is a contrast paint, it's actually creating a kind of a wash and filling in some of those shadows with a more saturated version as well. To help boost the highlights, I'm going to be using some Adriatic blue, and I mix this with some white, and this creates a really nice kind of complement color to that Kroxigor scales. And so I'm using this for just some select areas of these lenses, with a pure white highlight for just the very, very smallest part. And I've mixed together some Tyran blue and some Nuln oil to create kind of a dark blue wash, and I'm using that for all of these areas which I used the Cobalt metallic paint on. There's a couple of details that I just wanted to fill in real quick. So for example, the rock under the sniper's foot, I used a dark wood speed paint for this. This was just kind of to help out round out some of these smaller details that I didn't want to use an existing color for. So for example, the strap on the gun for the comms operative, I just threw on this quick speed paint. I'm using a neutral grey for their leg wraps, and again, I'm not too worried about anything kind of below the knee. I plan on doing some kind of dust on there. So I'm just throwing on a quick neutral grey, and then this is a neutral grey mixed with some black, and just kind of reinforcing some of those highlights. I'm not too worried about highlighting too much, just to kind of help smooth out some of that speed paint. I'm going to get the bases ready and drying, so for that I'm going to be using Golden Earth. This is a texture paint, so it's got some sand or some grit mixed into it. And this is the perfect kind of desert sand that I'm looking for. So I'm applying this with this tiny spatula and just going to let that dry while I finish out the rest of the models. I've decided to dry brush the rifles with some of that plate metal from earlier. So this is a very, very gentle dry brush just across some of the black areas. And that just helps kind of sell the idea that it is metallic. And then I'm also using this on any of the equipment that had that Nuln oil shade on it. So for example, the pouches and the goggles and the antenna. I'm using that neutral grey to kind of break up some of these orange areas with some weathering. So this is just a quick dab, a bit like I did with the white markings, but just on a smaller surface area, to kind of sell the idea that these are kind of chips and damage to the armor itself. And then for the drones, I decided to just basically replicate what I already had from the T'au recipe and just apply that to the drone itself. So I'm starting off again with a Grim Black for all of the mechanical stuff underneath, and then a Wild Rider Red for the kind of orangey base tone, followed by a Carroburg Crimson shade, and then a Trollslayer Orange sort of glazed on. This didn't really apply very well, so you can kind of see I'm almost dabbing this on to kind of build up that orange saturation. There was a ton of drones to pick from. I ended up going for the shield, the gun, and the recon drone, but I could always replicate this recipe and do the others that I didn't have built. I added some of that Elven gold again just to kind of accent those spherical designs and to help mirror it to the T'au counterparts. And then for the edge highlight, I ended up using a kind of yellowy white. This is some T'au light ochre mixed with some white. And this is to help edge highlight the drones. I wanted there to be just a slightly brighter edge highlight for the drones because, I mean, they're technically higher up in the air, so I just wanted the contrast to be a little bit sharper. And then to make them feel like part of the team, I then did my kind of wacky geometric markings on the drones as well. There was no real rhyme or reason behind this. I just wanted to see what looked cool, and I threw on some white markings and then added the usual weathering to that. To get a more accurate shape, I ended up doing kind of smooth markings on the recon drone because it is such a bigger surface area. But then I made sure to go back in with that Wild Rider Red and just kind of match the weathering to the rest of the team. I made sure to use some neutral grey for some of the damage on the tops of the drones here. And then for the lenses, I used exactly the same thing I did for the Pathfinders. So I base coated the lens in white, then I used Kroxigor scales, contrast paint, and this gave me a really nice kind of shadow in the middle of the bigger lenses. I let that dry, and then I used the Adriatic blue mixed with some white for an edge highlight. And then finally, I dry brushed some of that plate metal on for just kind of some detailing and some highlighting. To finish out the Pathfinders, I glued on some cork. This is kind of chopped up to look like rocks. And then I decided to use some Ochre rust. And this is a very yellow pigment paint. It's basically just a powder that you can kind of dust on to make it look like kind of dust and grime. And so I'm using this for the feet, just gently dusting it on. I don't want to turn it too yellow because it is very strong. And then finally I glued on some tufts just to kind of give the bases some visual interest. I finish out all the miniatures with a black rim around the base. And here they are, the T'au Pathfinders. I am super happy with the way they came out. I envisioned a really vibrant orange with a really vibrant neon kind of blue for their skin. I'm glad I toned that down just a little bit, but the orange stayed intact and they just look so vibrant and shocking on the tabletop. I know that this is an older team, but I've been dying to get these guys done ever since they came out. They've just been kind of sat on the shelf for such a long time. As always, I'm very, very eager to hear what you think. Let me know down in the comments below, do you like this color scheme? Are the Pathfinders even still relevant in 3.0? I haven't tried them yet in the new version, so I'm eager to see them hit the tabletop. A big thank you to the YouTube members, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, feel free to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already. I've got a couple more Warhammer projects coming up very shortly. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next one.